Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today on a webinar about how small businesses are faring 1 year into the pandemic. I'm Brett Theodos, Director of the Community Economic Development Hub and Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. Really excited to have you and our panelists for a really good discussion and some interesting and new data. This is a timely topic. President Biden is visiting a small business today and discussing the administration's efforts to support small businesses. And we have new evidence to bear on the question of how small businesses are faring. A couple of housekeeping matters before we get going with the content. First, the event is being recorded and the recording will go up online on the same events page where you have found the event. Speaker biographies are available online. We have a new feature, Zoom has a new feature, we have a new feature of captions that are doing their best to capture what has been spoken so that we can be more accessible. But if that's distracting to you, there's a live transcript CC button at your lower right in the menu there, and you can turn it off. All participants are going to be muted through the duration of the webinar. And we would like, however, to hear your comments or questions. So put them in the Q&A box. The chat feature is not enabled, but we'd love to see your questions in the Q&A box, and I will compile them and we will have time together to bring them forth to the panelists and get them in the conversation. So do put your questions there. Okay, a little bit of framing from me and some slides with some new data, and then we're gonna welcome our panelists up to the virtual stage. Let's start. And this is joint work with colleagues Eric Hangen, Jorge Gonzalez, Benny Doctor, and Chris Davis. So this is not news, but putting some numbers to it, we understand that Americans are still avoiding being away from home. That is somewhat sector specific, where we see those effects more. We do see food and accommodation sectors, understandably, and as widely noted and understood, the most affected. And that's had effects on payroll. Businesses have cut payroll in part to balance revenues against revenue losses. And we have seen revenue losses, though we have some differences in numbers that we'll be talking about in a little bit. There have been government attempts to help, several, not just the Paycheck Protection Program. This is the largest and the most has gotten the most attention. So far, 7.5 million loans and north of approaching 700 billion in dispersed funds. Still active PPP work going on. And there's been a distribution of businesses that have been supported under PPP. Certainly we've heard about challenges with PPP reaching the smallest small businesses and entrepreneurs of color, but yet many small businesses have still been able to access support under PPP. Okay, time for the new evidence. So we have worked with data compiled by Dun & Bradstreet to describe firms and their payment behaviors over time. We've purchased a nationally representative sample of 1 million firms with 3 or more trade lines. And so that means we're probably missing some of the very smallest businesses. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the results. But we needed a certain density of trade activity to be able to look at trends over time. Otherwise, the reporting gets pretty thin. And these trades are things like actual loans, but they're also payments that are happening for inventory or other matters. So you should think of it not just as loans activity. And the universe we got the universe of firms in 8 large cities to be able to describe them, as well as the national sample. So what do the data show? The data show that businesses are largely keeping up their payments during the pandemic. That is, I think, somewhat of a counterintuitive finding, and we'll describe in a panel about why we think that is the case. And it also, I think, in some ways contradicts the popular understanding. And yet, it is, I think, increasingly being documented that loan loans and other payments are actually performing okay, perhaps relative to expectations. That does depend on the city somewhat. We saw in San Francisco a bigger jump in delayed, slow, late, negative payments. New York City as well, some of a jump. But in other cities, very little change across the board, according to this metric. And so this is a chart that shows the indexes, the levels at the start, pre-pandemic at 100%. So this is not saying 100% of payments are delinquent. This is saying if we take the baseline as 100%, what's happened since then? And what it shows is there have been some sector-specific changes. We certainly have seen food service, hospitality increasing at higher rates than others, and yet it still is, perhaps more modest than would be anticipated. And so what are the reasons for that we're seeing? We lift up three, but we'll also bring in the panelists on this. The biggest being support under stimulus programs like the Paycheck Protection Program that really have given firms something on the order of 12 to 18 months of profit of what they would normally achieve as profit through these forgivable loans. Second dimension is they've scaled their costs, meaning painfully let go of employees or reduced physical space or other costs. And then lastly, for some of them, they're in forbearance. And so even though they may not be officially slow or late, it's not actually a good thing. So with that, we're gonna pause on the talk. This is getting our feet wet here, orienting us to some new data. And we will go ahead and bring up our panel and start our discussion about what this means and where we go. So a reminder, put your questions in the chat. If there's something about the data that I showed, I can dig into that a little more. But I want to start by introducing our panelists. We're thrilled to have you with us. So Deborah Fries, she is co-founder, president of Boston Impact Initiative. That group is a community investment fund, and they deploy capital to entrepreneurs of color in Eastern Massachusetts. So Deborah, great to have you with us. And also joined by Chris Wheat. He is the co-president, newly co-president of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. Chris, great to have you with us. Chris has been doing some really interesting work on the small business sector that he will lift up as well. And then always pleased to have Tim with us. Tim Ferguson is the founder and chairman of Next Street. Next Street is a mission-aligned advisory firm that connects small businesses with capital, customers, and services. So really a leading expert in this space. So first off, welcome to you all. So glad you can join us. And I just wanted to start with a pretty open question. We've got some new data that maybe are challenging somewhat of the common understanding, but also you talk to lenders and you get some similar stories. But I just want to hear from you, help us fill out our understanding a little bit. How are small businesses faring in our current moment? So let's just start off with that. Chris, maybe you'll kick us off.
Sure. And thank you, Brett. Thank you, Tim and Deborah. I'm looking forward to this conversation. These are always really helpful and interesting. So I will try to give a super top line, and I want to say one additional thing about the JP Morgan Chase Institute, just to clarify sort of what it is that we do and what kinds of small businesses are in our data. So for 5-6 years now, we've been looking at small business finances and really focusing in on a relatively a large universe of relatively small businesses. So these are JP Morgan Chase's business deposit customers. So think of them as they have a checking savings account, but not necessarily lending, not necessarily a credit card. And these are businesses typically around $100,000 at the median in revenue. So quite small businesses, but also we try to sort of limit our universe to what we would say are operating businesses. So think maybe your dry cleaner, saliently in this conversation. It's my dry cleaner is my reference small business that I think about when I'm looking at our analyses, right? So they may have a storefront, they might have a couple of employees, but the typical one would be a micro business. And we have about 1 million or so of these businesses that we look at, that we've been trying to understand their cash flows for a few years now. Long story short, Brett, you showed a series of slides, and those results are certainly resonant with what we've seen. So revenues is a metric that we can assess reasonably well, so we can sort of tell when we see cash coming in the door whether or not we think that's a revenue or not. And we definitely see this huge dip in revenues that I think isn't surprising to anybody who's been living through this pandemic for the last year with the rest of us. So March, April, we see huge declines in revenue. They vary by industry along the same lines. They start to come back up, which is to say they are less down than they were before. I wouldn't say that they have come back up to where they were a year ago at this point, at least what we've seen so far. But the really marked dips of 40% or so, more so in some industries, that started coming back up through May, June, July, and you still see this prolonged period of depressed revenues consistent with the activity that Brett, you showed. And so I think that's kind of the view that we see as well. And that's what you might see in other administrative data with a few differences. The other piece that we see as the bank is not just the dollars coming in the door, but because we hold the checking account, we see the outflows, which we can sort of parse into what we think of as expense payments as distinct from payments to creditors or other sort of financial services payments. Those track very closely with the revenues. And this is the kind of thing we'd seen in other similar situations. So we had done some research around hurricanes Harvey and Irma to understand what was happening there. And there we were, at least I was surprised to see I think they use the word painful, and I would probably use a similar word. I don't want to undersell flexibility is not the right tone, but you see many small businesses, as the revenues come down, pulling the expenses down almost as much, sometimes more, which often leads to a less intuitive story about the cash balances, which we have seen be really super important as a predictor of all kinds of important business outcomes in terms of growth and sustainability. And so the expenses largely have tracked the revenues. We can sort of unpack a little bit of that. But we do see the balances starting to recover a little bit faster than I expected. And even net of some of the program investments, which I think were intended to do so, PPP, but also just sort of general household focused payments, some of those for these very small businesses, that the finances are really integrated. So that arc, you can see the balances coming back actually above where they were for at least the median small business, a year prior. And those balances, at least the last that we looked at them, remain elevated. Although the trend is starting to was starting to come down back towards sort of where they were the last that we looked at these results. So that's kind of at a high level what I think we've been seeing, and can dig in more if it's helpful.
That's great. And we'll put some links to some of your pubs, or maybe you can do it, Chris, in the chat for people. But top line is revenues down, but expenses down, and cash balances up relative to before the pandemic. Deborah, let's go to you. What are you seeing in Eastern Mass? You've done some data collection work and obviously have a portfolio. Talk us through what you're seeing.
Cash, to Chris's point, cash has been a big issue. Let me speak from my portfolio. So we have about 30 companies, from startup to established longtime companies, but they're all hovering around, below 1 million. 50% of the portfolio is above 1 million, but just barely. The rest is, in revenue down to below 100,000, like Chris was talking about. And our companies we're mostly investing in entrepreneurs of color. And we saw before COVID, our typical way of understanding our portfolio is about 75% is what we call healthy or very healthy. And about 25% is maybe on our watch list, maybe in crisis. And that's about our target. We're trying to take on a lot of risk. We do private debt and private equity. So then in Q2, that was a very sudden reversal, right? We saw about a third of our companies were somewhat healthy, and 2/3 were really watch list, crisis, and mostly because of obviously revenues disappearing, cash. So a lot of Black and brown owned businesses are going in already to the crisis in a weak cash position. They don't have the financing that they need. They don't have the banking relationships even. And so we saw that reversal. And then we've been sort of crawling our way back. Q3, it was like 50-50. Q4 50-50, and now just assessing in Q1, we're saying, you know, we actually have 2/3 healthy and 1/3 not. And so what the basis of that is, I think it's really critical. These are all organizations that are in relationship with non-traditional finance players and technical assistance providers like ourselves. So even though some did not have banking relationships, there was advocacy, there was technical assistance, there was not just loan deferrals, but we did blanket loan and forgiveness of principal and interest payments in Q2. There was a coalition that formed in Massachusetts called the Coalition for an Equitable Economy that looked, as we did, at first wave of PPP, none of our companies getting it. And then forming the coalition, the policy, the advocacy work at the city, state, and federal level to start to say, wow, Black and brown owned businesses, small businesses, especially below 100K in revenue, are getting missed, are precarious. And now we need to actually do a lot of extra work to fix what didn't come through in the first round of the CARES Act. And so what I want to say about small businesses, we really have to segment the size, those really small businesses, which also are overrepresented by women and minority-owned businesses, were not faring well. And it's been a lot of effort to preserve them from closing. We only had one business closure during this period, but it was the intervention of the technical assistance and capital system and non-traditional finance that made that happen.
Thank you for lifting up that importance, and we'll see. I'm hopeful that some of the SSBCI money and other supports can get to the technical assistance providers that are doing this important work, and then ultimately to businesses that do have the need. Tim, let's go to you and just your opening thoughts on how you see it from where you sit on what small businesses are feeling in this current moment.
So, I mean, it won't surprise you that I agree and would reinforce a lot of what Deborah and Chris said. And our own experience, Next Street's own experience, we run two of the Small Business Solution Centers for New York City, SBS, and probably see somewhere in the vicinity of 3,500 businesses a year. So it's a very good and generally quite small businesses, so less than $1 million in revenue, and sometimes just sole operators. And I think that what the team would say is it's been a mixed bag over the last 12 months. So some of the businesses are barely hanging on. Some have pivoted, and some actually have done pretty well. So I think that it's very similar to the way that Deborah described how she's seeing her portfolio and also the evolution of it. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we would say the centers are seeing with the businesses that come to them is the question of rent. And there's been very little help for small businesses on this front. And at least, and we're a small business as well, we would say that landlords, for the most part, at least in New York, are not budging. So I think that mixed bag is what we would say, and it'll be interesting as we get into the discussion here on some of the programs that have been run as to what the impact has been, particularly on businesses of color.
Great. And one of my consternations in this space and sector more broadly is how poorly we collect data about businesses. So we are struggling to get as much out as we want to know. But let's turn next. I don't want to fully relitigate this, but in light of these findings, I do want to pause for a minute on PPP and the relevant other stimulus supports. On the one hand, the data show pretty clearly that PPP was not effective at preserving jobs, and it wasn't efficient at doing so on a cost per job saved basis. On the other hand, the data do seem to me to indicate some degree of effectiveness with respect to saving businesses and the cash flow balance increases that Chris, your data has showed. I'm interested how much you feel those do map back to PPP. It seems like a pretty big run up right after the first round. Yet we also know, and I and others have been critical about the delivery channels for PPP not reaching as far or wide or as deep as they needed to, especially around small businesses, entrepreneurs of color. So let's start, Tim, with you this time. And if you could help us understand the past, but really in order to understand the current moment with respect to PPP and how businesses are faring.
So I think that our experience in the first round of Triple P was that very little of the money actually got to the businesses and the communities that we work with. So primarily communities of color and businesses owned by people of color. And that's reflected in the delivery mechanism, I think, as much as the rules themselves, because the Triple P deployment, 94, 95% was basically from the banks, all sizes of banks, but there was, I think, as the press made very clear, there was a predominance of the larger banks within that initial round. I think CDFIs, community development finance institutions, were less than 6%, which was relatively small. But when you look at where they actually lent to, most of it went to non-white zip codes and LMI communities. So that was a positive. I think that to your point, Brett, is that this most recent round, we haven't seen the data yet, but we know from some of the initiatives that the SBA have introduced, for example, allowing a particular period where certain financial institutions, CDFIs as an example, had an advantage, a head start in terms of deployment, but probably it will have shifted and changed this time. And we'll see. But I think that I would say that it looks more encouraging than it's been in the past. I think that in terms of the learnings, I would say a couple of things. So one is clearly that traditional financial institutions, dominate the small business lending landscape, but leave behind LMI and non-white communities, which is a challenge. It's still a challenge, and there are many reasons for that, and some of them are systemic. Others are around how credit is assessed and looked at. I think that the alternative institutions like CDFIs can leverage deep community roots to effectively reach LMI and non-white communities and lend more equitably. Responsible online lenders, and there are responsible online lenders, can also lend more equitably by democratizing access to small business financing through technology primarily. Early days, but it means that the on-the-ground relationships are not so important. And then finally, I would say, in terms of learning that both CDFIs and online lenders require access to responsible, affordable capital at scale to expand both their reach and their impact. So, it's still, I would say, early days. And, as an entity that works deeply in communities, we would say that the pandemic, the rosy aspect of the pandemic, notwithstanding all of the hardships that have been incurred, is that it is leading to the discussion and the debate about both what capital needs to be provided to small businesses in the communities that we're working in. Like Deborah suggested, her organization has got both equity and debt. Equity is something that's relatively new and needs to expand, and we need to think differently about how we look at credit, the so-called credit box, for the debt lending that's being done.
Deborah, your reflections on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tim, I'm in total agreement with what Tim said about where we're seeing the differences. And we did in Massachusetts, because we weren't getting the demographic data from the SBA, we did a survey June, July, conducted by Mass Inc. that this coalition put together. And we got some really interesting data. So Black-owned businesses were the least likely to apply for PPP, so at 62%. And most likely to get denied at 19% versus 5% for white-owned businesses. And so you have to look at the issue of trust. So we talked about the banking relationships may not be there to begin with. there was also a major trust issue, as well as I don't want to take on this debt. So a real fear about taking on debt, not really understanding what the conditions of forgivable would be, not trusting the institutions that were providing that forgiveness. And so we looked at, yes, eventually, like I said, none of our portfolio got the PPP in first round, and by the last round, we did get it for everybody. But it was a hard conversation with a lot of entrepreneurs who are like, I can't take on debt right now. I don't understand or trust forgiveness. I need grant capital. And ultimately, what ended up making the difference was state level grants that we lobbied for. So I want to give an example of a 4th generation African-American family-owned childcare center, chain of childcare centers, high-end, high quality, very well-placed and ready to succeed, this close to going out of business. And it was grant capital, an infusion of that money that made the difference. And this company is going to have a chance to have a real growth opportunity on the other side of all of this. So issues of trust, non-institutional relationships, and the whole question of understanding debt and understanding non-traditional financial instruments, which we can get into more later, but things like royalty finance and purchase order finance, other types of tools that entrepreneurs might get more comfortable with if they knew about it, but fixed rate 5 to 7 year term loans that they otherwise think of as debt are not the types of things that serve them at this time.
Thank you for that. Chris.
That was well laid out. And so I'll only lift up a couple of things. So Deborah, like one of the things that you mentioned, or several of the things that you mentioned, but I'm particularly thinking about the piece around sort of trust and sort of how the beliefs around how the capital flows were going to go and sort of like what it meant to engage in these relationships. An echo and through line that I feel in that and hear in that is at least one-fold, maybe multifold, across kind of the experience of COVID, structural differences that predated COVID sort of are, like playing their way through. And this is certainly one of those, right? And so one way to sort of think about that particular piece is like, yes, that was a known disparity that existed before the fact. And so you're faced with a new challenge, but it is not wildly structurally different from some of the credit challenges the credit making challenges that existed before. And it just kind of got sort of expanded and magnified through the time of COVID. So it's kind of like one reaction, or at least sort of lifting up to what you just said, as opposed to your question, Brett. So apologies for that. The other one, or the other, one more, and then one last one after that. Across the small business sort of financial support, I think what we have seen is that as time progressed from, March, when it's like we need to figure out what to do, and sort of rolled out a way to get capital to businesses, and sort of had opportunity to iterate on sort of like what would be a better way to get the capital out. I think we are seeing more equitable distribution. Kind of like thinking about the way you laid out what happened, Tim. I think that's exactly right. I don't want to undersell that it's really important to get the cash quickly, and like the amount of time that passed between the sort of beginning of April and May and June and July, whatever. Like I don't want to say that was immaterial, but it is interesting to see, or not interesting, like not surprising to see how that became more equitable over time in a way that is, again, I feel that echo with what I felt about the vaccine rollout. Not at all my field. I am not an epidemiologist, but it's just sort of thinking about my own family, right? And sort of like seeing where access was and wasn't. It struck me that it had a similar, we're in the middle of a similar kind of progression of, I hope we are in the middle of a similar progression of kind of equitable rollout. So just kind of think about sort of what all the institutional structures are that are driving that. And what was the first reaction, because it was to your question, Brett, about sort of saving jobs versus saving people. I don't know how I would price this, so I don't know how I would do the efficiency measure. So sort of take this with a large lump of salt. There is a theory that there is value in preserving the connection between the employer and the employee, in addition to sort of in addition to getting money to people who need it to buy things. This is something I don't know how to price, but I think that was at least implicit in some people's view of the theory was like, well, we want to support the small businesses and the employees because we want to maintain the relationships, with some view to it is difficult to sort of reconstruct that. Not being able to price that, I cannot weigh in whether or not it was like a sort of an efficient deployment of resources, but it is part of the nuance that I think that I struggled to unpack.
Great, super helpful, all of your reflections. Yeah, if there's one thing that I wanted to add, it was just that I do feel some heartburn or consternation around, we're spending now approaching $750 billion subsidizing businesses under the stimulus. And a lot of those firms actually didn't need the help. Other countries managed out of the gate to have a revenue shortfall test built into their subsidy. We opted not to do that. So now we are, now in the latest round of PPP. But the heartburn or consternation is, my gosh, what could those billions of dollars have accomplished at reaching the entrepreneurs and the communities that really needed the help? That could have been absolutely transformative. But here we are, and we've had the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which is enormous as a stimulus. We've got $30 billion for food service. We've got another $15 billion for EIDL, the economic injury disaster loans. We've got another $1 billion plus for the concert and other venues. We've got more money for PPP. So my question at this moment, where we are right now, we also know what we know and don't know what we don't know about vaccines and what the virus is doing. But in this current moment, what would you say to policymakers is needed? More of the same, something different, wait and see how the money hits the street, what SSBCI actually shapes up to be. What do you think is called for in the current moment? Whoever wants to go first with that one.
I can start. So I think there's a number of things that we could probably go, I've got a whole long list. So I'll try to just do a few of them, but I want to start with an example again, and that'll get to what we need to do with policy. So we had a company come to us, longtime sole proprietor, Black-owned company that produces branded products like mugs and sweatshirts and things, who had a $200,000 order from the city of Boston. And no one would provide him with financing to buy the inventory up front to fulfill the order, and he had to pass on it. So we came along, and now we've structured a line of credit for him that is used against purchase orders. So it's purchase order finance. Again and again and again and again, we find entrepreneurs where there is no finance structure that suits where they are. So whether it's equity, like Tim mentioned, or purchase order finance, receivable financing. I've got a bunch of companies right now with government contracts that get paid to reimburse, and they have no cash up front to buy the things that they need to do to get reimbursed later. So there's a lot of non-traditional finance and other community investment funds and non-traditional financiers like ourselves out there saying we've got to get beyond the fixed rate term loan and start providing other types of capital. And one role that policy can play is to actually move forward with guarantees, especially government. Guarantees would allow all of us to take on risk that we need to take on right now that a lot of lenders and investors won't take on. So we were fortunate as a nonprofit to raise a philanthropic pool of our own guarantee capital. So we raised guarantee capital so we can now make loans to folks that don't fit our own risk rating. So part of it is we need government to come forward with guarantees, and we really have to address this procurement problem. There's a federal civil rights complaint right now against the city of Boston, who's spent only 1.2% of nearly $2.2 billion in procurement on Black and Latino owned businesses. So there's a whole engine available to move money through procurement, through different types of financing, and through guaranteed capital, which is really high leverage. That would not be that hard to put together. It's all got precedent. And then I just want to say that the role philanthropy has to play with it is to provide the catalytic capital that allows that money to move. Also guarantees, also recoverable grants and forgivable loans, things that where we're sharing risk. And finally, to take a risk on all these emerging first-time fund managers of color who are trying to reach entrepreneurs of color that have no track records and need catalytic capital. So the decision makers about who gets to receive investment, the profile of that is changing as well.
So I think that was really well said, Deborah. And I think that the thing that I would emphasize in there is that there's a lot that can be done through simple leadership at the political level in the cities. So Deborah's point about the city of Boston, that's not a recent problem, right? I remember having conversations in 2007. It was the same issue that it is today. Some of the cities, like for example, under Mayor Emanuel, Chicago intentionally said they wanted 40% of their procurement to come from women and minority-owned businesses. I think it's running now, the latest data was something like 36 or 37%. That makes a huge difference. The flow of actual revenue into businesses is really, really important. So cities and states too have a lot at their disposal and tools that they could use. I think one of the biggest challenges is how we actually arrange the financing. So to Deborah's point around purchase orders, often receivables financing, which is effectively what it is upon completion of the contract. Whereas what's really needed is for the cash to get to the business relatively quickly so that they can invest in more talent, so jobs, or in the machinery that's required to fulfill the particular set of orders if they're significantly greater than the volumes that they're used to. The system is such that at the moment, there's very little paid effectively in advance. There are some anchor institutions that have actually done that, but they're still relatively few and far between.
I love both of those sets of ideas. The only incremental thing I think I would add, and this is a little bit based on research and a little bit based on sort of intuition, trying to thread it together, is particularly local governments, I think, might try to do some specific neighborhood level targeting. And I know that some have in the prior rounds. The part that is based on actual research is that in the past, we've seen like really market differences between neighborhoods in terms of small business cash liquidity. Pick your outcome of interest, but in particular, in sort of like how much cash do the very small businesses hold? You see very, very large differences driven by things like income levels, wealth levels, housing costs, things like that, and certainly racial composition. Is that shaping what is happening right now? We are anxious to look to see whether or not that is true, because it seems like it is likely to be, but to the extent that there is, I think that kind of targeting, in addition to the targeting that we've already seen around industry, which I think has been appropriate, of whatever these programs can make a lot of sense, especially given, Brett, you listed a bunch of American Rescue Plan pillars, which I think are really important, but just the state and local financing in and of itself, right? Many states and cities are going to be in a position, I think, to see might they do something incremental to support small businesses, perhaps aligning along the lines, Deborah, what you had suggested in the prior answer around maybe some grant financing and things like that for the very small. You might take that and shape that and target it to make it especially effective.
Terrific. Yes, there's a lot of money there. Thank you for lifting that up as well. I'm gonna throw out one more question. We're gonna draw on some questions from the Q&A. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we will get to as many of them as we can. But the last thing that I wanted to get you all to reflect on is the role of philanthropy. So in my experience, most philanthropy has had a somewhat diffident relationship with small business, less focus there than housing or childcare or other areas. I do think COVID has awakened us, and even before COVID, increasing awareness around race equity gaps, around the importance of small business for wealth creation. But on this other hand, we know that small business lending is risky. 50% of new small businesses fail within 5 years in normal times, not even in COVID times. So I'd love your reflections on what do you have to say to that sector to most effectively, most efficiently use their money to help entrepreneurs begin, so we overcome divides in who is an entrepreneur, but also to scale. So what would you say uniquely that sector can do, or additively beyond the public sector?
So Brett, I think it depends upon what you mean by that sector. So philanthropy in and of itself is narrowly defined, which tends to be foundations and permanent endowments. I think it's unlikely that they will shift materially towards providing grant dollars or PRIs to small businesses. It doesn't mean that some do not. So for example, Chris knows full well that JP Morgan Chase is a very big grantor in the small business space, particularly for entrepreneurs of color. I think that the encouraging signs for me in the last 12 months as a result of the pandemic is the shift in the way that the corporate sector is thinking about their money. And often it's tied to their business interest, which is probably a good thing, just as JP Morgan's is to some extent, because they have a small business in its own right. So I think that that's encouraging, and we see it in our own work. So for example, somebody like GoDaddy has prepared a number of webinars, seminars in TA in terms of providing it to the to the small businesses who ordinarily wouldn't have access to that. So I hope that they will continue to sustain that type of program and that type of work. And we certainly see a lot of inquiries. So Starbucks, Verizon, a whole bunch of others who are beginning to say, yep, this is important for our future, for the future of our employees, for the future of the returns that we're able to deliver to shareholders, and for the communities that we operate in. So from my perspective, if you are including the corporates as philanthropy, I think that there's a lot that they can continue to do. And I hope that they don't stop, because the recovery, the economic recovery picks up and we just go back to how things always were before.
I'm very tempted to just restate something, Deborah, you said before, which is, I mean, you mentioned it, I think in one of your prior answers about like philanthropy playing a really important role in kind of catalytic capital demonstration projects, identifying the things that the market might not find that could scale as programs, as distinct from that are only targeting businesses that might scale. And I make that last point only to say that I think a lot of the terrain that is more familiar to sort of the broader universe of philanthropy around sort of household financial well-being, I think sometimes small business advocates, we could do more to storytell in such a way to make it clear how those lines run together, particularly around the smaller small businesses. And so I've lots of experiences learning how to do that better by doing it not as well as maybe it could have. But when we see economic insecurity, that is often going through those families that are getting a material or most of their income through a business that they own. It's like 20 million, plus families for whom this is true. It's like a large piece of the economy. And I think that sometimes that is just missed. And yes, it would be nice if people just saw it differently, but and nice to encourage philanthropy and other sectors, quite frankly, to sort of see it that way. But I do think advocates could do a better job or could do more as well to sort of connect that thing that you are interested, you might service really well by targeting the people who have the most income volatility, who tend to be the small business owners, so to speak.
I guess I just add, whether it's a corporation doing philanthropy or a foundation or a family office, whatever it may be, there's a phrase in the world of impact investing, my sector, that has become popular recently about full spectrum capital. And if you go out and you get your market rate returns on one hand, and you get your negative 100% return on your grant. There's all this room to play between, 0 and negative 100. And, maybe like 1, 2, 3, 4%, people know that's CDFI land, whatever it might be. But this negative land where I put, money out and I get 20% of it back or 80% of it back, that is what I think philanthropy needs to explore. And to do that, they're gonna have to break down the silo between the grant making side and the investing side and really start to explore how to put money out where they share risk with the folks using it.
Terrific. A big hear for that as well. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we are getting coming in. Try to cover as many as we get to. I actually think what Margaret Bradley just wrote relates quite well with what you shared, lifting up the potential of DAFs to do some direct investing and just expanding beyond some of the traditional giving pathways. So another question or comment that we got from Jeffrey Ash was around any thought of using social capital to guarantee loans in saving circles or other structures. Do you have hopes that alternative models can be effective in the sector? And if so, is there a certain segment of business that you think they are better fits for? And I guess relatedly, is there something the SBA microloan program could do better? Or is there something that the federal government could do better to help scale some solutions?
So certainly we've seen a lot of solidarity lending on the ground, especially with businesses below the radar, the non-banked businesses. And I think it's enormously powerful. And some of the conversations I've had with community groups, we sort of said, what is the best way that we as a financial institution can partner? And that's where I don't know the answer to that. I think Jeffrey's raising a great point, because there is the idea of the solidarity circle. Where does the institution come in? Again, I think it's the guarantee territory, and it's the underutilized tool where there's still the autonomy and that sense of trust within the solidarity circle, and then a safety net under it that guarantee capital could put in, as opposed to anything that would co-opt the wonderful dynamics that are happening as community, different circles of people come together and are interdependent with their finance. So that would be, to me, the best way to enter that relationship.
No, and I would encourage that it's not all about guarantees, right? I think that some level of support in that regard is helpful. So California has a number of state-run programs that smart CDFIs, like, for example, Opportunity Fund, have used to create a whole new segment of the market. So trucking loans to particular communities who wouldn't otherwise have access to the capital. Their delinquency rates are tiny as a percentage. And if you look at the CDFIs overall, their delinquency rates are 1 to 2% or lower on a pretty consistent basis, including through the pandemic, right? So I think that I would challenge us collectively to be, to Chris's point, the storytelling is to figure out how we change the way that we think about credit, the way that we have a belief system around whether small businesses in the communities that we're talking about repay or don't repay. I mean, in my experience, they're always repaying. So, the default levels are actually lower than if you look at the mainstream lending that's done to what has historically been predominantly white-owned businesses. So I do think that how we tell the story and how we bring it to light is really, really important.
One little thought. I mean, I was thinking about it because I used to think about microfinance institutions like literally all the time, and then some years have passed since then. So this may be a little bit out of date, but I suspect it's not. Another way that people outside the microfinance sector might plug in constructively is to identify the microfinance institutions that have been able to maintain the low loss ratios, right? To not pass on super high lending costs, which some, at least historically did, and to do it at scale, and to either sort of help lift up the lessons across, or to provide the support to help other microfinance institutions kind of like build and scale in that direction. It just strikes me that there are many, not all sort of deliver so well. And if we could have more, or sort of more supply of sort of the best flavors of microfinance, there could be some room for others to kind of support that, rather than just doing the guarantees, which, yeah.
I like all of these ideas. The way that I often think about what solutions are needed are scaling them relative to the depth of the need of the support. And so there are firms for whom the guarantee is the right answer. And there are firms for whom an interest rate buy down or some other form of subsidy. And yet there are firms that deeper subsidies are needed, and not just money help, but technical assistance and coaching and the like, access around procurement, or cutting through city agency bureaucracy to get the business in the right place, clearing tax liens, whatever. We did a report looking at a program in Chicago, and we can put this in the chat, the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, that combined grants on the order of 30 to 65% with a CDFI-backed loan, because even CDFIs were not willing to step in with the full loan, given the risk profile. So that's obviously a big form of subsidy going to a business. But if we want to overcome some of the divides that exist around entrepreneurs of color in this country, we're going to have to do the cheap things cheaply, because we don't have money for everything, and then do the more intensive things intensively. Tim, you wanted to come in? No. Okay. All right. A couple other comments or questions that we got through, a couple of technical ones. One for Chris, a question from Mark Schweitzer wondering around if your data can speak to where PPP loans and other assistance have been spent, including rent, costs, and other payroll. My look at your chart is a lot of it sat in bank accounts for a long time, but I'd love your reflection on that.
No, that's a great question. So there are some things that we see well, and there's some things we don't see as well. Payroll is one thing that, we see electronic payroll super well. So if you happen to pay your employees through, a payroll processor, of which there are a few large ones and a handful of smaller ones, we have used that in the past to try to identify things like that. And so I think we might be able to do an okay job there. Rent has been a bugaboo of mine personally for now a very long time. We've had lots of ideas about how we might identify it, and it's surprisingly hard, particularly to the extent that people are paying through checks and things like that, because to us, it should be clear that the data are de-identified. I probably should have said that at the top. And so it's not as easy as it might appear to sort of get that rent line, which I think is a super important question. Tim had lifted it up before, I believe, in terms of the challenges around small businesses are likely facing around rent, and we've gotten lots of inbound questions about that. It would be a tremendous help to have better data on that question. We are not quite there yet, although we continue to work on it.
Great, thanks for that. And then we have a couple of questions around how states can do better, what approaches can actually be influential or convincing. And I wonder if there's anything that you would want to lead up with or lean on there that you've seen in the work. Why does California have that program, Tim, and why don't others? What can be done to help? It strikes me that we have a lot of innovative solutions, and yet we don't have them everywhere. Deborah, your program as an example. What do we need to do to get you in Western Mass and all the other places where we need you? So what are your reflections on how to diffuse and convince?
Well, you just gave me quite the little lead there. So I have to at least respond to that, which is exactly what, what people asked us, are you guys going to scale and replicate? And we're like, no, what do we know in Boston about Chattanooga or New Mexico? So we have a cohort of 11 communities around the country that are trying to build funds like ours that are appropriate and relocalized to their own place. So the, integrated capital deploying the racial to close the racial wealth divide. In New Mexico, it happens to be for Indigenous women. In Seattle, it's for Black tech entrepreneurs. And so each place is determining their own need. But one of the things that we've talked about in this work is how, if you're going to do place-based work, and I think whether that's at the neighborhood level, like Chris talked about, which I think is really essential, city level, regional level, state level, it has to be through multi-stakeholder relationships. And that means we've got to deal with, right, the financial institutions, the entrepreneurs, but also, yes, government and policymakers, and yes, worker services organization and the civil sector and grassroots and faith-based institutions, et cetera, and anchor institutions. And so, what I'm seeing now in Massachusetts with this coalition, and I think many places would say we have a notoriously competitive environment. This crisis has brought us together. This crisis has created more cross-sector relationships, coordination, partnering, and advocacy than I've ever seen in this space. And so it feels, and a lot of learning from place to place, meaning what we're learning in Massachusetts, different people in different sectors are in conversation in other cities and states. And so it feels to me like, again, as many of people said, COVID is an accelerator and an amplifier. And so there's a window where it looks like this extraordinary weaving together of the ecosystem in order to affect policy in a meaningful way is happening. Whether that gets sustained through the recovery, I think is a really significant question. But right now, I've seen great successes at the state level because there's a multi-sector set of perspectives coming in and shaping policy right now.
Tim or Chris, anything to add on that point?
No, I mean, I think that, other things like CBDG, there was a question in the chat about that. I mean, it is under discussion, and I think it's likely to be reformed at the federal level, but it's being pushed hard by the CDFAs or whoever in particular states is responsible for those programs. And I would encourage that to be a constant clarion call, when talking with elected officials at both the city and the state level, because I think that it does make a difference. And I should say that we're kind of talking about the Triple P earlier. I mean, the reality is, Brett, to your point, that $700 billion plus has been deployed effectively by the SBA, when I think the highest level they had before that was 30 to 35 billion a year. So, it's been quite a mobilization, and it hasn't been perfect for sure, and it hasn't got where we want it to get to. But I think it has awoken people, to Deborah's point, and hopefully the coalitions can continue and the advocacy can continue to make the changes that are needed.
I was only going to thank, I guess, the National Council of State Legislatures and the National League of Cities for trying to do some of this work to kind of clarify sort of what's happening across cities, because this morning I was trying to use those resources to understand what's there. So it's also true that there are some people, some organizations that are trying to make sure that are building the kind of coalitions that we were talking about, but also trying to sort of get the metadata, you will, as it might be, right, about like, well, what if you wanted to know what's happening in another state, like where might you look? That is at least one place. I don't know that it's the best place, but it is where I was looking this morning as I was writing you guys emails. So.
Awesome. Unfortunately, we have to pause there. Our hour is up. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Tim, Chris, and Deborah. We'll put the slides up on the webpage, and you have the link to the blog in the chat, but that's on the web as well. Thank you so much for the discussion. Thank you for joining, and we'll be in touch. Keep up the good work.